welcome to 15 Minutes in Canberra. I'm Hayley Channer, Senior Policy Fellow with the Perth US Asia Centre. My guest today is Sam Bashfield, soon to be Dr. Bashfield. Sam is a PhD candidate and research officer at the Australian National University's National Security College. Sam joined the NSC in 2018 and his research focuses on Indian Ocean security issues. So he's the perfect guest for our Perth US Asia Centre audience. Sam's also extremely accomplished. He's received an ANU Professional Staff Scholarship and the National Security College Award. Prior to ANU, Sam interned with the Jakarta Globe newspaper in Indonesia, worked at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, and he's also worked in government for the Attorney General's Department. Sam, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Hayley. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast.
So how did you come to work for the National Security College at ANU?
So my background at the university has really been in languages and international relations and national security, both in undergraduate and masters at Monash and also at the ANU here in Canberra. I've worked across, since graduating, I've worked across a variety of research project support roles, doing research assistance, and as you mentioned, also working in the public service at the Attorney General's Department. So as you mentioned, I've been at the National Security College since 2018, working in the executive education team initially, and also doing research assistance work while doing my master's program. In 2021, I switched to a full-time PhD study in February, and it's been a real privilege to be, have self-directed learning, to really engage internationally, and to be given such a long leash in the backing of the National Security College to read and write. I just love being given the freedom to tug at threads and jump down rabbit holes and uncover new insights. And national security is really a fascinating subject, as often it bows down to power and how power is established, how it's wielded, how it's perpetuated, and even how power is lost as well.
Yeah, such a good point. I mean, you just articulated all the reasons why I like working in national security. But in addition to working at NSC, you have also worked and lived overseas, including in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. What was the experience like of living in Indonesia? How would you describe Indonesian people? What do they think about Australians? And what should Australians know about Indonesian society that perhaps we don't know?
Yeah, Hayley. So Indonesia is such a fantastic country and such a privilege to study. I've actually studied Indonesian since year 7 in high school. I did a student exchange to Malaysia during high school, and then I continued that Indonesian study through university and into honours. But yeah, specifically, as you mentioned, I was in Yogyakarta, and it's just such a fantastic place to study. Yogyakarta is home to a variety of universities. So it's really home to a variety of students from around Indonesia. And one thing that, I'd impress on Australians is just the cultural diversity that Indonesia bears. And really that's borne out in all of the different cultures and religions and languages that the students in Yogyakarta speak and understand. And, the Indonesian national motto is Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, which means unity and diversity, or out of many, one. Which really exemplifies that, Indonesia, just like Australia, is not culturally monogamous. It's a wide variety of cultures and languages and different backgrounds that are there.
One thing that's always intrigued me working in our field of strategic studies and international relations is the Australia-Indonesia relationship has had a lot of ups and downs, but we're very close neighbours, and I think the people-to-people links are very close as well. Is there a way you think the Australia-Indonesia relationship could get closer and something perhaps that we haven't been doing that we really should be doing to make the security relationship closer?
So I think the first thing to mention is the horrible COVID-19 conditions that Indonesia is facing at the time of recording in July 2021. And Australia should be doing whatever it can, as it most probably is, to assist Indonesia with this current spike. And, whatever we're facing with COVID at the moment, it's much worse in Indonesia. But as you mentioned on the Australia-Indonesia relationship, it is just a natural roller coaster, in my opinion. Australian Indonesians have some common values and interests. We have some divergent values and interests, and I think that it's just natural that the relationship at the government level will continue to be like a roller coaster and experience its ups and downs. But in terms of as the Perth US Asia Centre engages in that geopolitical element of the relationship, I think it's really important that Australia and Indonesia continue the very close military cooperation that we enjoy. Assisting Indonesia with purchasing the appropriate hardware and ensuring that any cooperation is mutual. And I think one thing that from my time in Canberra and also at Sydney, at the University of Sydney, is the immense activities that Australia and Indonesia do together and that are at the government level currently and in the last few decades. I think often the good news doesn't receive media attention, but the bad news does receive media attention. So often there is so much amazing work that goes on between Australia and Indonesia that maybe doesn't receive the media and social media attention that it deserves. But I think continuing that and working out how we can cooperate during this COVID pandemic and ensuring that the engagement goes back up to how it was pre-COVID is really important, because there is so much going beneath the surface that people just don't hear about.
That's so true. I mean, the only news you hear nowadays is really negative news, not just about COVID, but you don't get to hear all of the fantastic good news stories about how we're working with Indonesia on counterterrorism or policing or illegal activities at sea. There is such a robust relationship there. Moving a little bit more to the west and looking to the Indian Ocean, I know you have been looking into the Indian Ocean and in particular the British Indian Ocean Territory. I wanted to speak to you about one of the islands that's part of the British Indian Ocean Territory, Diego Garcia, and how there is a US military base there. Sam, can you talk us through, how did a US military base come to be on this tiny island in the middle of the Indian Ocean? And what is it that's controversial about Diego Garcia?
So that's right, Hayley. So Diego Garcia is the largest atoll of the Chagos Archipelago, which constitutes the British Indian Ocean Territory. And the British Indian Ocean Territory is some 600 islands located right in the centre of the Indian Ocean, just below the Maldives. So importantly, the US military base on Diego Garcia, although it's modestly sized, it's a critically important US military base. And it has a few roles, such as its large and protected lagoon harbours naval vessels and submarines operating in the region. It has quite a long runway that's capable of hosting the largest of US strategic bombers, such as the B-52 and the B-2. And it really enables the US's global strike concept, which provides for prompt conventional weapon strikes anywhere in the world. Also, 1/3 of the US preposition afloat force is in Diego Garcia's lagoon. So there's 9 large cargo-esque ships that are brimming with military equipment, from tanks and munitions and medical equipment and other vehicles, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice, and able to support units for up to 1 month that are in Diego Garcia's harbour. Lastly, it also has a myriad of communications and intelligence functions. So while this base is there and has been there since around the 1970s, the base it's quite controversial at the moment for a couple of reasons. So firstly, there's a sovereignty dispute that's currently raging between Britain and Mauritius. So one thing to mention is that this base belongs to Britain, and it's technically a joint base between the US and the UK. However, Mauritius believes that the territory was illegally dismembered from Mauritius back when Mauritius attained independence in 1965.
Oh my gosh, dismembered. That makes it sound even worse, doesn't it?
Exactly. And that all went all the way to the International Court of Justice just in 2019 in a ruling in favour of Mauritius. But it's a really fascinating example of even when the UK and the US lose cases, or the UK in this example loses cases in international courts, they don't necessarily follow the opinions that were given. But there's also a human rights element to this issue, as around 1,800 people were forcibly removed from the archipelago in the late 1960s and early 1970s at the request of the US to ensure that they'd have exclusive access to the entire archipelago. So these people and their descendants, who are now known as the Chagosians, have fought in British and international courts for their right to return ever since.
Okay, so what's the next step then with Diego Garcia in terms of legal battles, or what can we expect?
So at the moment, we just have a continued stalemate between Mauritius on the one side and UK and the US on the other side. So Mauritius will continue to agitate for return of the archipelago. So they've foreshadowed possible cases in the International Criminal Court. And at the moment, we have no word from the Biden administration or from any officials since about any updates to the policy. So at the moment, we just have Britain claiming that its sovereignty has been theirs and is rightfully theirs, and Mauritius who agitate for their return. So for Australian policymakers, the British Indian Ocean Territory and the military base on Diego Garcia has been a really important staging post. So most ships in the last 2 decades, most Australian naval vessels that head to the Middle East have been stopping at Diego Garcia. Obviously, the intelligence and communications function that are on the archipelago is quite important and would presumably be received and be beneficial to Australian interests. So far, Australia has been one of the only countries to support UK's claim of the territory. So Australia voted with the United Kingdom in 2019 at the International Court of Justice. Its policy since has definitely been in favour of continued British sovereignty of the territory. And it can be safely asserted that Australia does attain quite a lot of benefits from having the US in the Indian Ocean and the commitment that demonstrates to the favourable US balance of power in the area.
And I suppose too, Australia gets the benefit of having a resupply island in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, exactly.
Sam, related to this is another dispute, this one involving India and Mauritius. India's militarisation of an island that belongs to Mauritius, which I'm going to butcher the name of, Agalia?
Agalega?
Agalega. No wonder I couldn't say it.
Or Agalega, depending if you're in Australia or Britain.
Oh, yes. Look, if I was still in Queensland, it would sound even worse if I tried to. So why is this controversial? What is happening with this island?
Sure. Thanks, Hayley. So this one, it's a bit less controversial. It's a bit more telling of geostrategic developments in the Indian Ocean. So Agalega is a small series of islands, about 1,100 kilometres north of Mauritius in the southwest Indian Ocean. There's about 300 inhabitants there, and the island is Mauritian territory, as you mentioned. So about 5 or 6 years ago, Mauritius and India entered into a partnership to develop military facilities on the island. So while the island is not especially newsworthy normally, it's currently under the media microscope due to this India's new military base that's being built on the island with the permission of the Mauritian government. So specifically, they're building a new 3,000-metre runway, which will be capable of accommodating India's growing fleet of P-8I maritime surveillance aircraft that would be operating in the southwest Indian Ocean. There's also a new port, a new deeper water port being developed on the island, and also an array of communications equipment that's being installed there. So the project's set for completion at the end of 2021, but recent Google Earth imagery has shown the real scope of this project, which analysts before didn't understand, because the project has been very tightly held by both the Indian and Mauritian governments. So recent Google Earth satellite imagery has really shown, the extent of the runway, the extent of the port developments. And as I mentioned, there's a real, human rights concern for these 300 inhabitants on the island, which is quite small. And while there's no suggestion at the moment that these people will be, forcibly removed from the island, there's definitely life won't be the same for these people again with this new military facility operating. But it is also a lot of geopolitical elements to the new Agalega facility, as this really extends India's reach into the southwestern Indian Ocean. Potentially, this new facility might be able to be used by other friendly countries that operate P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft, like Australia and India. And it's really an indication of growing expansion of India's strategic interests in the area, and the importance that it places on that southwestern Indian Ocean area.
Sam, you've had a very interesting and diverse career working across government and also overseas. I'm wondering if you have anything that's been unusual or weird that's happened to you in your career that's a sort of funny story that you would like to share.
Yeah, sure, Hayley. So one thing that comes to mind is the PhD work that I'm doing at the moment is primary historical, and I'm spending a lot of time at the National Archives at Australia, leafing through government archives, which mostly consist of memos, intelligence reports, cables, and cabinet submissions, all related to the British Indian Ocean Territory, which there's mountains of it in Canberra at the National Archives. And while these reports can often be dry, sometimes formulaic, and sometimes repetitive, Sometimes these meetings do go awry, and some of these details that end up in these reports make me laugh out loud sitting in the archive reading room. And one example is a March 1974 meeting between Australian officials and the Shah of Iran before a visit that was a visit to Australia by the Shah that took place later that year. Some of these documents, the officials get very honest and put far too many details in these documents, which they classify and think that will never be released. And for example, in this meeting, the Shah was complaining about having to negotiate with newly decolonized African nations for food imports. He was saying that Australia will supply Iran with uranium, quote, on binding terms, and describing the Soviet Navy as imperialist. And the best bit about it was that diplomats at the end of the short cable, which was being sent electronically back to Australia, said that further details of a one-sided discussion by bag, referring to the diplomatic bag that would receive the full transcript. So I'm not sure if they thought that these documents would, ever really get into the public eye and be read publicly. But these really give an insight into how national security and defence policy, it really comes down to the people who are engaging in these meetings and who are formulating this policy. And they really paint a vivid picture of the scenes that take place. And even though, these meetings are happening every day between Australian officials and their foreign counterparts, they're often hidden by security classification markings and aren't released for many decades. So I just love being in the archives and being able to see, what happened several decades ago, because it's definitely still happening today.
It's also a really dying art that people actually physically go to the archives to read hard copy documents of things. So I'm really glad that you're doing that and producing the very valuable research that you are. Sam, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and providing such a fantastic overview of what's happening in the Indian Ocean. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Hayley. It's a pleasure joining you.